Every day, thousands of Christians suffer persecution simply because they follow Christ. On a daily basis, millions of believers face the possibility of having their property confiscated, their leaders beaten and jailed, and their families harmed, kidnapped, or even murdered. The early Christian church had suffered in many ways, but how were believers to understand the significance of their suffering? What could Jesus' example teach them about their difficulties?
The record of Jesus' actual experience of suffering and death is filled with well-known events. The betrayal by Judas, the prediction of Peter's denial, the failure of the disciples to watch and pray with Jesus in Gethsemane, Jesus' arrest, the two trials and Peter's denial, and finally, Jesus' crucifixion and burial.
Whatever difficulties and temptations the Roman Christians faced as they suffered for Christ, they could be sure that Jesus had already faced them. He had been unjustly condemned in a Roman court. He had been beaten by Roman soldiers, and he had been crucified on a Roman cross. But through his suffering, Jesus had been victorious. Yes, they would suffer, but their suffering would be their path to glory, just as it had been for Jesus.
Jesus taught that his followers would face opposition in society. They would have conflicts with their families. They would be tempted and harassed by demonic forces. They would be persecuted, and some would even be killed. In fact, he made it clear that persecution and suffering would characterize the church until his return. But Jesus also gave his disciples great hope by assuring them of the final victory of the kingdom of God. For example, in Mark chapter 13, verses 26 and 27, he reminded them of the great victory that would be theirs when he consummated his kingdom in power and glory, as long as they remained faithful to him. For the Christians in Rome, this meant that their sufferings were part of a larger spiritual war. And even though they might be oppressed and persecuted for a time, they were still on the winning side, and one day they would have complete victory. And the same is true for us today. The suffering of the church is part of Christ's plan for victory. As Paul wrote in Romans chapter 8, verse 18, our present sufferings are not worth comparing with the glory that will be revealed in us. Our celebrations of the Lord's Supper remind us that Christ's victory will eventually overcome all our sufferings. One day, we will be rewarded by celebrating a victory meal with Jesus himself. As Jesus had said in Mark chapter 8, verses 34 and 35, "If anyone would come after me, he must deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whoever wants to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for me and for the gospel will save it." In one way or another, every Christian has a cross. But the glory and blessing of salvation is worth the sacrifice.
Suffering for the sake of Jesus and his kingdom shouldn't discourage us. It should comfort and inspire us. We suffer because we're his servants, and we're confident that one day our suffering will be rewarded with blessings beyond comprehension, blessings that more than make up for the difficulties we endure.